So welcome everyone. I will be speaking today on gambling and gaming concerns in developing youth, focusing on intervention and treatment. My name is Marc Potenza. I have a series of disclosures with respect to pharmaceutical, gambling, gaming, nonprofit, healthcare, and legal entities. And I thought I would start today thinking about how gaming and gambling have been considered within the main nomenclature systems. Currently in the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and the 11th revision of the International Classification of Diseases. But if we go back to prior iterations of the DSM, pathological gambling, now called gambling disorder, was introduced in the 3rd edition. And it was classified as an impulse control disorder not elsewhere classified. So this was a rather heterogeneous grouping of disorders that in moving from DSM-4 to DSM-5 became reconfigured. So gambling disorder was reclassified together with substance use disorders as addictive disorders. Trichotillomania was moved into outside of this impulse control disorder section, together with obsessive compulsive related phenomena. But what remained in the impulse control disorder section was essentially disorders characterized both by impaired impulse control and going against social norms. So antisocial personality disorder and conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder were added to this grouping. But if we went back to earlier times, including when some of these studies were conducted 20 to 25 years ago, what are now considered behavioral addictions were considered as impulse control disorders. And so we were interested in understanding the extent to which impulse control disorders were going unidentified and perhaps untreated within hospitalized settings. So in 2 separate studies, John Grant, myself, and others screened over 200 adults who were being admitted for psychiatric purposes and over 100 adolescents who were being admitted for psychiatric purposes. And what we found was that although 1 to 2% of the individuals were diagnosed with an impulse control disorder upon admission, when we actively screened and did follow-up diagnostic interviews, we found that 30 to 40% of the individuals met criteria for an impulse control disorder. And if we looked at the adult sample, we found that there were no differences in admission diagnoses for mood, psychotic, or substance use disorders in the adults with and without the impulse control disorders, suggesting that these conditions cut across a broad range of psychiatric concerns. What we found also consistent with the co-occurring phenomenon is that the impulse control disorders at a trend level were linked to multiple non-impulse control disorder diagnoses. So individuals who carried more substantial psychopathological burden were more likely to also experience the impulse control disorders. Among the adolescents, we saw something a bit different, where impulse control disorders were associated with internalizing disorders like mood and anxiety disorders. And there may have been a ceiling effect for the externalizing disorders as they were high in both groups. And then the most robust statistical association was with prior hospitalizations, where the group with the impulse control disorders, about 3/4, had been hospitalized previously, with closer to 40% in the non-impulse control disorder group, suggesting that by not having these concerns identified and treated, this may be leading to recurrent hospitalization. So when we looked at the sex-related differences in the adolescents according to the impulse control disorders, we did see some gender-related differences. Some conditions were similar across the conditions, like intermittent explosive disorder, which was the most common. But Gambling disorder followed a pattern that we see in the general population where higher proportions were observed in boys than in girls. But we were also a bit surprised that compulsive sexual behaviors and pyromania were more female predominant, which, for example, compulsive sexual behavior disorders among adults, both within clinical samples and community samples, tends to be more prevalent in males. So a big change over the past couple of decades has been the growth and the penetration of digital technologies, including with respect to how people are using the internet. And so going back 20 years, we were interested in problematic usage of the internet. And in our high school survey of 4,000 to 5,000 high school students, we defined problematic use of the internet according to the Minnesota Impulsive Disorders interview. We adopted the criteria and we defined problematic internet use as an irresistible urge to use the internet, a growing tension or anxiety that could only be relieved by using the internet, and having tried to cut back on use of the internet. And if we use meeting all three of those criteria as defining problematic usage of the internet, we found that 4% of the high school students back in 2005 to 2006 reported problematic usage of the internet. We found that it was more common in certain groups of individuals, including individuals of Asian and Hispanic backgrounds. And across the entire sample, we found that problematic usage of the internet was associated with substance use concerns, depression or dysphoria, and aggressive behaviors. So when DSM-5 was being considered, there were questions raised about whether internet use problems should be considered as a diagnostic criteria. This is an article from Time magazine going back 13 years where in anticipation of DSM-5, it asked the question, what counts as crazy, and gave some examples of the new abnormal that included binge eating, internet addiction, and sex addiction. And these were nomenclatures or diagnostic entities that were being considered, and all three of these areas could potentially fall under addiction frameworks. But how did the Substance Use Disorder Committee consider internet addiction? At the time, they determined that they believed that the internet was more of a delivery device than the focus of an addiction, and that one should focus on the behavior rather than the delivery system. So at the time, there had been substantial data coming out of Asia and other jurisdictions about deaths in internet cafes in Korea, as well as other concerns, parents leaving their children unattended and them passing. The substance use disorder group considered that internet gaming might be most relevant as the basis of a disorder. And by internet gaming, they focused on cross-jurisdictional forms of multiplayer games that were often engrossing, interfered with sleep, and interfered in a way with other life activities. So they did not feel that there were sufficient criteria at the data at the time for the criteria to be included in the clinical section, so they put criteria for internet gaming disorder into the section 3, the future research section, and they modeled the criteria for internet gaming disorder after gambling disorder. So there are aspects of tolerance, withdrawal, preoccupation, interference in major areas of life functioning, as well as other criteria that largely followed not only gambling disorder but also substance use disorders. So Diagnosing internet gaming disorder in the DSM-5 involved meeting 5 of the 9 inclusionary criteria. So this threshold is substantially greater than that for substance use disorders, where 2 of 11 criteria are needed, as well as for gambling disorder, where 4 of 9 criteria are needed. But like with gambling disorder, the severity ranges from mild to severe based on the number of inclusionary criteria that exist. And going back to our high school survey, we also included, beyond questions for problematic use of the internet, we also modified the Minnesota Impulsive Disorders interview questions to assess problematic video gaming. And when we asked about the proportion of students who reported playing video games, at the time, boys were more likely than girls to report gaming. We found that close to a little over 3/4 of the boys and less than 30%, less than 1/3 of the girls reported playing video games. And that among the boys, gaming was not linked to any negative health measures. It was actually linked to lower odds of tobacco smoking. However, among the girls, gaming was linked to multiple negative health measures, including higher odds of depression and aggressive behaviors like getting into fights and carrying weapons. And these data at the time resonated with those from focus groups, such as reported in the book Grand Theft Childhood, where girls were more likely to report adverse features in association with gaming. However, if we looked at the group that experienced problematic gaming, 2 to 3% of the whole group, or about 5% of the group that reported gaming, met criteria for problematic video gaming using those same 3 criteria that I had mentioned previously. This was male predominant, where there was approximately a 2-to-1 male to female ratio. And across the sexes, the correlates of problematic gaming included regular tobacco use, drug use, depression, and getting into serious fights, so multiple negative measures. So as I mentioned earlier today, the internet has changed many behaviors, including gambling, where going from 2009 to 2020, there was an approximately 3-fold increase in the online gambling market, going from about $20 billion to $60 billion. But there are also these blurred boundaries between gambling and gaming. Some of them involved sports, where daily fantasy sports were not considered as gambling. They were considered a skill-based phenomenon, and thus they were legalized in most jurisdictions in the United States prior to the changes in the sports gambling laws. There are other blurred boundaries, for example, with social casino games, where this represents an intersection of social media, gambling, and gaming. So these online platforms are not technically gambling, as they do not involve placing money at risk in hopes of gaining something of greater value, more money. But they have casino-like elements that may teach youth how to gamble. And they also include microtransactions, where one can pay money in order to get extended time that is initially free, or to go to higher levels. And the participation in microtransactions has been linked to online gambling initiation and participation and subsequent problems. Now, there's also the phenomenon of competitive gaming, or esports, which may involve actual wagering, but also within gaming wagering, if you will, with skins. And skins are items that may, for example, adorn weaponry. They may not be game enhancing, but they carry value both within the virtual world and in real life. So then there are also loot boxes and loot crates, which are virtual, randomly generated items that contain skins or other items. And because of the random elements, some jurisdictions have considered them to be gambling or gambling-like elements and have considered them illegal, whereas other jurisdictions are debating this. Now, gambling may also be directly incorporated into the storylines of video games, as can be seen here in this Grand Theft Auto Diamond Casino and Resort version, which mixes gambling, gaming, and violent behavior. And when certain jurisdictions blocked this version of Grand Theft Auto, there was debate in the gaming community with one individual writing, so far there's no reason for the thing to be blocked in my country. We have loot box mechanics freely available, and so are microtransactions. I don't see how this, buying chips in Diamond Casino, is illegal. So this raises questions and concerns about how individuals, perhaps youth or young adults, are viewing the boundaries between gambling and gaming. Now, also, as mentioned, there's the mixture of violence. And in the United States, there have been several rare but high-profile incidents that have involved the intersection of gaming or gambling with mass violence. So in one case, a young gamer went to a gaming tournament and killed several individuals with firearms. And then in Las Vegas, someone who was described as a heavy gambler shot a number of individuals out of a casino when they were watching a music concert. So we were interested in understanding the extent to which weapons and weapon carrying were associated with gambling and gaming in our high school sample. So what we found was that weapon carrying was associated with more permissive attitudes towards gambling, perceived parental permissiveness towards gambling, more family gambling concerns, that is, having someone in the family with a gambling problem, at-risk or problematic gambling, and relatively diminished associations between at-risk problematic gambling and gambling with other individuals, including family, friends, and adults in general. And so taken together, these findings suggested to us that more socially isolated gambling linked problematic gambling features and weapon carrying. And we found a similar pattern with respect to gaming behaviors, particularly among youth with high sensation seeking. So these findings suggested to us that perhaps interventions that target isolative and sensation seeking youth might be worthwhile to consider in line with Patricia Conrad's work. So it's important to note that esports has been growing over time. If one looks over the past quarter of a century, there has been a big following growing for esports, where the viewerships of for example, the League of Legends championships surpassed major sporting events like the NBA Finals, as well as the Super Bowl in the United States. There has been talk about incorporating esports into the Olympics, and some of the major sporting leagues in the United States, like the National Basketball Association, have generated gaming leagues, the NBA 2K League, which includes drafting top players, and one can follow the gaming equivalents of the NBA teams in media. And one place where one can track esports in media is on ESPN. So like one sees for traditional sports of the NFL, NBA, Major League Baseball, collegiate football, there's a section for esports. Now, there's also the phenomenon of professional gaming, and there are platforms like Twitch where individuals can go and view people playing video games. And there are certain individuals who can earn a living playing video games, some people who can earn large amounts of money, but most people don't earn that much. It's kind of like playing sports, where there are some people who go on to become professional stars, but most people do not. But it complicates discussions that parents may have with their children about setting limits on playing video games. So one person, Ninja, who has been very successful, was reported to be making $500,000 every month playing Fortnite, and he does this through people subscribing to his platforms as well as advertisements and other deals. So I think it's also important to consider gaming from a developmental perspective, where gaming has become, during certain stages of development, particularly for boys, a normative way in which youth connect. And it may be appropriate for them to socialize through gaming, and if youth are not participating in gaming, they may experience feelings of being left out of the group and ostracized. So keeping all of this in mind, I think it makes it challenging for parents to help their children navigate, particularly boys, through their developmental stages with setting limits on gaming. So if we go back to the main nomenclature systems, we talked about the DSM-5, what about the ICD-11? In anticipation of the ICD-11 being generated, there were a number of World Health Organization related work groups that met beginning in Tokyo in 2014, and we met every year until the pandemic. And these meetings focused on how internet use might be considered from a psychiatric perspective, particularly with ICD-11 in mind. And during these meetings and in the scientific field, there was debate about whether a gaming disorder should be a formal clinical diagnosis, with a group of scholars arguing against it being included, and another group arguing that it would be important for diagnostic, management, and prevention considerations. And this debate was also seen in the lay media, where on back-to-back days in 2018, there were headlines about game addict disorder is a moral panic, and the National Health Services to open an addiction clinic for young online gamers. And this was occurring in the setting of other headlines like this, where young individuals were demonstrating oppositional behaviors in the setting of their parents setting limits on their gaming. And so we put forth another paper saying that it was important to include gaming disorder in the ICD-11 from clinical and public health perspectives. When it was being announced that the World Health Organization was considering including a gaming disorder in the ICD-11, the gaming industry put out a statement saying that they believe that there was not significant evidence for it being included, that the evidence for its inclusion remained highly contested and inconclusive. And so we contributed a piece in the journal Addiction asking whether this was a corporate strategy to disregard harm and deflect social responsibility, considering that it was about 30 years ago when the CEOs from tobacco companies went in front of the US Congress to state that they did not feel that tobacco was an addictive substance. And so what happened in 2019 at the World Health Assembly in May, gaming disorder and hazardous gaming were included in the ICD-11. The features are shown here, with the central features being impaired control over the gaming, increasing precedence being given to the gaming such that other interests and daily activities are pushed to the side, and continuation or escalation of the gaming despite negative consequences. There also needed to be significant impairments in one or more important areas of functioning, as well as these symptoms occurring over a 12-month period, but the time frame can be shortened if all diagnostic requirements are met and the symptoms are severe. And data out of the Kurihama Medical Center in Japan suggested that for those individuals being treated on intensive or inpatient levels, that maybe 5 to 10% of those individuals, youth, adolescents, experience those symptoms in less than 12 months. So there was also debate about whether hazardous gaming should be included in the ICD-11, and so I contributed this case report where there was reports of a patient dying at a veterans hospital while a nurse's aide was playing video games, raising the question of, from a public health perspective, whether these entities are needed. So hazardous gaming, the key features are shown here, and essentially this is problematic engagement but not reaching the level of a disorder, and this is important from a public health perspective as on a pyramid where the most severe cases are at top. As one goes down the pyramid, there are more people engaging in risky behaviors, so the public health impact may be more substantial. So we were also interested in sex differences in gaming and social media use and problematic engagement in these entities. Going beyond our high school survey data, so we conducted a meta-analysis, and in that meta-analysis from over 30 countries worldwide, we found that internet gaming disorder was largely male predominant. Social media addiction or problematic use of social media was largely female predominant, and internet addiction was in between the two, showing a slight male predominance. But even with the male predominance, it's important to consider females and gaming behaviors, as those their problems may also be substantial. And gaming also intersects with other behaviors beyond gambling, and this is a naturalistic experiment of sorts. When the Fortnite server crashed in 2018, what was reported was that during that crash, the percentage of gamers on Pornhub, a major pornography website, increased by 10%, and searches for pornographic videos using the key term Fortnite increased by 60%, suggesting that there are these complex relationships between gaming and pornography use that warrant further consideration. So if we take a step back and think of some of the models that have been proposed for addictions, going back to over several decades, a reward deficiency model suggests that natural or possibly learned rewards that are not the focus of the addiction may elicit less robust responses in people with addiction. A dual process model suggests that poorer cognitive control over more robust motivational drives related to the object of the addiction leads to addictions. And then the interaction of person, affect, cognition, and execution model, or IPACE model, incorporates these and other considerations. So I'll talk about some of the data that may support these models and thinking about gaming disorder within these frameworks. So we and other groups have used different brain imaging tasks to look at cognitive control, like the Stroop color word interference task, and then reward processing, like the monetary incentive delay task. And if we look at resting state functional MR magnetic resonance connectivity in individuals with gaming disorder and those without, we found that within an executive control network, we found that there was greater cohesiveness within the control group as compared to the group with internet gaming disorder. And in the sample, we found that greater cohesiveness was linked to greater cognitive control as evidenced by performance on the Stroop outside of the magnet. Then in a meta-analysis of volumetric studies, gray matter volumetric studies, we found that individuals with gaming disorder or internet gaming disorder had lower gray matter volume in regions like the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex, brain, particularly with the anterior cingulate cortex, implicated in self-control, as can be seen in this NIDA slide here, showing the sagittal section. So brain regions that have been implicated in inhibitory control and motivational drive are showing these volumetric brain differences in individuals with internet gaming disorder. As I described earlier today, the monetary incentive delay task fits with a reward deficiency hypothesis for both substance use disorders, gambling disorder, as well as in a separate study using a different task for internet gaming disorder. And we've also found similar blunted reward responsiveness in youth who were demonstrating features of problematic use of the internet on EEG measures. Now, this is the full originally proposed IPACE model that I had mentioned. I'm going to focus on some elements, particularly this middle section, and think about how the addiction process may change over time, where these perceptions of external or internal cues might then lead to affective and cognitive responses that are under some inhibitory control and leads to decisions to behave in specific ways that initially are more related to gratification than compensation, but then the outcome leads to reward expectancies as well as specific coping styles that then feed into how people respond to these triggers. And if we think about later stages, those same external and internal triggers might lead more to cue reactivity and craving that are under poorer inhibitory control, leading to more habitual engagement in behavior that is linked more to compensation and may then lead to affective and cognitive biases that feed into cue reactivity and craving. And more recently, in that article, we also proposed brain mechanisms that may underlie these shifts in behaviors in line with prior biological models, for example, from Trevor Robbins and Barry Everett, where there's a shift from the more gold ventral striatal behaviors to the more blue habitual dorsal striatal driven behaviors. And more recently, we updated or clarified the model to say that while these shifts from gratification to compensation may occur over time, these are not linear shifts. And this is important to recognize within treatment settings. We've also proposed models where we have suggested that specific therapies or interventions might target specific aspects of an addiction model to try to break the cycle of gaming or engaging in addictive behaviors more generally in problematic fashions. So with respect to interventions that have empirical support, there are no pharmacotherapies that have regulatory indications for internet gaming disorder or gaming disorder. There have been multiple trials that have been conducted, some of which have shown positive results. For example, bupropion may improve internet gaming disorder and major depressive symptomatology, and these often go together, they often co-occur. And bupropion and escitalopram may also each improve internet gaming disorder, and bupropion may also decrease impulsivity and inattention or ADHD-related features in internet gaming disorder. With respect to neuromodulation, we, in work led by Lulu Wu, have observed that transcranial direct current stimulation over the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex has led to improved regulation of craving and improved regulation of emotion and better outcomes in internet gaming disorder. There have been other data with repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation over the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in gambling disorder, also reducing craving, but none of these have regulatory approval for either disorder. And then residential treatment, there are few locations in the United States that have the options for treating problematic use of the internet or internet gaming disorder, but there are a growing number of outpatient clinics and groups that are recognizing this and the importance of intervening. And when intervening, what are the interventions that have empirical support? One is Klaus Wöfling's STIKA intervention, which is efficacy of, which is the short-term treatment of internet and computer game addiction. And this is a cognitive behavioral therapy-based intervention that has empirical support. You know, we've reviewed the approaches for treatment for gambling disorder, gaming disorder, problematic use of social media, problematic pornography use, and problematic shopping and buying in a recent American Journal of Psychiatry article, the February issue of this year. Some of the studies that are described in that article and in others have been conducted over the past decade. This one was looking at a craving behavioral intervention in internet gaming disorder where there were the active condition is in blue, the control in red. The active condition was led to a decrease in internet addiction severity, weekly gaming time, and craving in response to gaming cues. If we looked at a brain-based level to try to understand the mechanisms that were involved, we found that the activation of the insula changed with respect to the response to gaming cues. And furthermore, connectivity between the insula and brain regions that have been implicated in craving, such as the precuneus, were found to be decreased. So the insula involved in craving and interoceptive awareness, linking to other brain regions that are involved in craving, seems to be one potential mechanism. We also, in the resting state data, found that there was decreased connectivity in the group receiving the craving behavioral intervention between the orbital frontal cortex and the hippocampus, as well as between the posterior cingulate and the supplementary motor area, as well as periorlandic regions, suggesting that decreasing brain regions involved in emotion regulation or decision making and contextual memory, as well as between regions involved in craving and motoric functions, might underlie the craving behavioral intervention efficacy. Now, we've also used other approaches. This was a trial of an emotional bias modification to treat people with internet gaming disorder. This was a trial that involved 90 participants with internet gaming disorder, some of whom received the active EABM training, and the others who were allocated to sham training. The training involved linking negative words to gaming cues and positive words to non-gaming cues in the active condition. And the active condition was superior to the sham condition in terms of reducing compulsive gaming behaviors and compulsive thoughts on a modified Yale-Brown obsessive-compulsive scale for gaming. And when we looked at the brain mechanisms on a regulation of craving task, we found that under the gaming look condition, there was a relatively decreased connectivity between subcortical and cortical brain regions. And during the gaming decrease condition, where people were actively trying to control their responses, there was increased connectivity between cortical and subcortical brain regions. Furthermore, we found that the decreases in functional connectivity during the gaming look condition operated through decreases in gaming-related compulsivity to lead to decreased internet addiction severity related to gaming. Now, we've also looked at gender-related differences in the neural responses to gaming cues before and after gaming. We found that males, as compared to females, showed a more robust striatal response to gaming cues, and that in males, the relationship between this activation and self-reported craving to the gaming cues was statistically significant, although females showed a largely similar pattern. We also then looked at how brain activity to the gaming cues related to the emergence of internet gaming disorder among individuals who at baseline were recreationally gaming. So we scanned 150 or so individuals, and then 1 year later, 23 of them had developed internet gaming disorder, and so we selected a match group that maintained their recreational gaming. And what the experimental design is shown here, there was a pre-gaming responsiveness MR session. During fMRI, they were playing a video game, and then the power was cut, and they then had another gaming cue exposure. And the cue exposure task is shown at the bottom, where there were either faces or just the computer screen, and in both cases the computer screen, some with gaming pictures and some with typology. So what was observed here was that the lentiform activation, particularly post-gaming, in response to the gaming cues, was related to the transition to internet gaming disorder in a manner that was linked to the craving responses being more strongly linked to the activation in the group with that transitioned. Now, we've also looked in other data to look at transitions more generally here in problematic usage of the internet, and this is a study out of Korea, where a group of middle school aged youth was assessed at baseline for at-risk problematic use of the internet, at-risk or high-risk, and then there was a low-risk group. So at baseline, 15% of the youth fell into this higher risk group. And if we looked 1 year later, most of those had remitted, but 15% persisted. And then in the low risk group, close to 12% had transitioned into a higher risk group, with the majority staying in the low risk group. So the take home from this is that while prevalence estimates may stay similar over time, there may be substantial transitions with respect to who is experiencing problematic usage of the internet. And we were interested in the features that were related to these transitions. And in addition to games, days of internet gaming being one measure, where days free was inversely linked to the emergence of at-risk, high-risk problematic use of the internet. The other features were elements of ADHD, where cognitive ADHD symptomatology was positively linked to emergence, and hyperkinetic features of ADHD were inversely related to remittance from at-risk or high-risk problematic use of the internet. More recently, we've used the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, which is a longitudinal study of over 11,000 children in the United States. And there are yearly assessments with respect to behavioral and psychological measures, and every other year brain imaging measures. Here we were interested in online social activity and ADHD symptomatology in the sample, and we used the random intercept cross-lag panel model to ask the question whether online social activity led to subsequent ADHD symptomatology, or whether ADHD symptomatology led to more online social activity. And what we found was that it was a unidirectional finding, where online social activity led to ADHD symptomatology a year later as children moved from late childhood into early adolescence. We did not see the reverse with respect to ADHD symptomatology leading to online social activity. Furthermore, this effect seemed driven by girls rather than boys, where going from time 2 to time 3 and time 3 to time 4, where we saw those cross-lagged effects, we see that the bolded areas on top to the left are significant for the girls, but below that, they're not significant for the boys. So there are other contextual factors that warrant consideration with respect to changes in gaming, and one of those has been with the pandemic, where there were concerns about how youth were engaging in gaming and other online activities during the pandemic. And there were reports that gaming increased during the onset of the pandemic, with Fortnite use increasing 70%, viewership platforms like Twitch showing increases as well. And then different groups came out with statements about gaming, where the gaming industry promoted gaming to increase socialization and reduce stress through their hashtag #PlayTogetherApart campaign. The World Health Organization had perhaps a more balanced approach in their hashtag #HealthyAtHome guidance, where they recommended more balanced approaches to gaming. And then over time, there were concerns that whether the increased gaming would lead to more substantial detriments, and this still warrants consideration, as for example, the effects of the pandemic in the United States on the schooling development has been more sustained for the groups who were affected. Now, trying to understand the mechanisms that may be at play, we were involved in a longitudinal study that started before the pandemic and went into the early part of the pandemic, looking at the relationships between problematic gaming, problematic smartphone use, and psychological distress. And a different pattern emerged over the onset of the pandemic. Specifically, the areas that are highlighted in yellow are the ones that that demonstrate these changing relationships, where problematic gaming before the pandemic was led to subsequent psychological distress. And then as the pandemic began to take hold with quarantines and the like, problematic smartphone use was led to subsequent distress, whereas problematic gaming was no longer linked to subsequent distress. And we hypothesized that as in times prior to the pandemic, that problematic gaming would lead to distress, but then as the pandemic raised anxieties, concerns, a lack of understanding, and perhaps developing youth went to their smartphones, they may have been overwhelmed with the information, leading to distress in that context. That was speculative, but warrants further investigation. So in conclusion, gaming disorder and other forms of problematic usage of the internet are new concerns. Gambling and gaming behaviors have been converging, including through the use of digital technologies, but in other ways as well. And translating an improved understanding into better prevention and treatment advances is still a challenge, and how different governments and jurisdictions will take information to generate better policies and prevention approaches is important. So I'd like to thank a large number of individuals, funding organizations, and thank you for your attention.